Good evening, everyone, and welcome to St. Mary's College. My name is Arlene Montevecchio, and I am going to let a few more participants in before beginning officially. Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome virtually to St. Mary's College. My name is Arlene Montevecchio, and I am the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's in Notre Dame, Indiana. The Center for Spirituality was founded in 1984 with generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, who have and continue to be pioneers in the education of women. We are very excited to have such a great turnout tonight for our panel, part of our Endowed Fall Lecture Series. We have two accomplished speakers, Professor Maria Teresa Davila and Father Daniel Horan. And before I introduce the first panelist, I would like to read the St. Mary's College Land Acknowledgement Statement. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Native people and their traditional homelands on which we stand. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have been utilizing this land and its resources for many years and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we acknowledge the Native people and their culture within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. After delivering their prepared lectures, tonight's panelists will then comment briefly on each other's remarks, creating a dialogue that we hope continues through question and answer time. I want to let you know that we will open the chat box, and we encourage you to type your questions in the chat box feature of Zoom. Those questions will go to our panelists, and we will ask and answer questions as time allows. Without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce Professor Maria Teresa Davila. Maria Teresa Davila, PhD, focuses her energies on questions of ethics and public theology in the United States, such as migrant and racial justice, the use of force, the role of government, and diverse visions of the common good. She grounds her efforts in the option for the poor as a central insight of who God is, how God acts in the world, and what ought to be the church's character. She serves as visiting associate professor of the practice of religious and theological studies at Merrimack College. Along with her husband and 4 children, she participates in St. Joseph's Parish in Malden, Massachusetts. Welcome, Professor Davila.
Thank you, and good evening. I want to just thank everyone for being here tonight on a Monday night, remembering to tune in and joining us for this topic, and of course, St. Mary's for the invitation to be here. I've titled my comments to you today, Who's Really Ready to Receive Laudato Si? What popular movements have that Catholic churches don't. And I'm going to share my screen for a PowerPoint just to guide us through the conversation. Recently, marking the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si, activist Gabriela Holguín from Argentina recalls being exposed to Laudato Si for the first time. She describes heading back with other participants after the World Meeting of Popular Movements in Bogota in July of 2015, where they had been given as a gift a copy of Evangelii Gaudium and Laudato Si. The ride back was long, and so they read the document along the way, discussing it during pit stops and meals. Holguín describes in essence feeling seen. Quote, with every word, we felt a reference to what we had just lived at the encounter of popular movements. As we traveled, Laudato Si became incarnate, expansive, and grounded in the passion of our experience at the encounter, close quote. Hearing Olguin and other activists working directly with popular movements, including worker collectives, indigenous groups, eco-activists, and representatives from local governments and community groups throughout Latin America, parts of Asia, such as the Philippines and Africa, describe their affinity for Laudato Si, I notice a clear disjoint between their reception of its message and that of most Catholic churches and commentators in the US. I suggest this difference is due not so much to cultural or social differences, but mainly to differences in the grounding that informs, shapes, characterizes, and animates them. This difference lies precisely in what Pope Francis called spiritual worldliness and excessive clericalism in Evangelii Gaudium. It is the difference between those whose pastoral activity for justice already brings them in touch with those who ought to be the first concern of the church, those already incarnate in the world of the impoverished and struggling, who are the protagonists of Laudato Si, and those more concerned with guarding a tradition whose expression in ritual and doctrine are often divorced from the realities of the most vulnerable. Laudato Si is addressed to, quote, every person living on this planet, close quote, but its approach, theology, and praxis are rooted in the incarnational principle of the preferential option for the poor. That is, God entering our reality and experiencing our suffering and death. It invited the faithful, churches, organizations, corporations, nations, and the global community into the decentering exercise of hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. It called for the profound realization that, quote, everything is connected. To churches in the United States and diverse church hierarchies globally, it was a profound interruption of the idolatrous navel gazing that has consumed Catholic public life for many decades. To faith groups, community activists, popular movements, labor organizers, and others already engaged in the messy work of justice building across interests and constituencies, Laudato Si was received as an affirmation, encouragement, and theological rationale for the work they were already doing, as well as a summons for building alliances with others. So who's really ready to receive Laudato Si and work for climate justice? It is no surprise then that the reception of Laudato Si is most palpable among those sectors that can respond in three important ways: sense of urgency, nimbleness in organizing an action and modes of solidarity, and closeness to the ground, closeness with the poor. On all three of these areas, popular movements and activist groups were most ready to engage the call of Laudato Si. Francis's papacy, most of his messages, and Evangelii Gaudium emphasized the church outside the doors of the temple, demanding that bishops ought to smell like sheep and for the faithful to hagan lío, or raise holy trouble. Laudato Si and subsequently Fratelli Tutti are written from a church without boundaries or walls to a world urgently needing care and transformation. So, urgency. We are running out of time. This is the statement most often mentioned by activists and leaders of popular movements observing the 5th anniversary of the encyclical. Quote, the strategic moment is wearing out. The climate crisis is a grave matter. There is no more time for negotiations or palliative measures. The church has the moral duty to call for this conversion and be the first witness to that radical change. And I just want to call your attention to the image you're seeing before you. That's actually a photograph from today. There's currently in the Caribbean the Caribbean Sea, an oil tanker from Venezuela with 1.3 million barrels of oil sinking. And there is that the threat and the possibility that it will spill into the Caribbean Ocean. So, excuse me, the Caribbean Sea. And it would be the biggest natural disaster of that region if it does come to fruition. So as I'm saying this, I'm sort of dreading for my people in Puerto Rico and just all Caribbean nations. That's that notion of urgency. Groups working incessantly for impacted communities and ecosystems understand too well the urgency spoken of in the encyclical, that which many Catholic commentators in the US labeled as foolish alarmism is the daily bread of communities living downstream from the throwaway of consumer societies. These communities felt directly legitimized by the document in their urgent clamoring for justice, so much so that many have put aside their entire lives in order to become ardent advocates of the environment and the communities most impacted by this crisis. Nimbleness. Coalitions, cooperatives, movimientos amplios or collectives of movements, syndicates, workers' organizations, neighborhood initiatives, and small level government officials, town mayors, and city councils, these groups exhibit nimbleness in their goals, organization, and action. They represent the ability to shift focus when a particular sector is in urgent need of convergence and allies. It also represents putting aside one's group's agendas or cause for the purpose of adding to the strength of those who need help most immediately, or where pressure and action could be most effective in bringing about desired change. The image you see in front of you is from last summer's 2019 feminist activists throughout Puerto Rico came together to essentially demand that the governor resign over a set of very sexist texts, a chat that demeaned women's collectives and women activists and women legislators and lawmakers in Puerto Rico. And so women activists from many different groups put aside their agendas to collectively come together for this particular very focused action. Perhaps this nimbleness can be better described as a modality of solidarity, especially among groups close to impacted communities, such as indigenous peoples, women and migrants, and workers. Leadership in these groups is characterized by constant organizing, decentering, multiple leaders, including women, meeting, strategizing, sharing of ideas, concerns, sharing of power and influence, sharing numbers of members, and other resources. These alliances and collaboratives are not easily achieved, but they build and preserve a united front against certain forces that prey on and threaten the poor and the environment equally and without limits. For these groups, Laudato Si legitimizes their sense of agency, one that may or may not be within the governmental structures or the boundaries of what is legal, but that is effective in interrupting environmental violence nonetheless, even if briefly. Closeness to the ground and closeness to the poor. A basic requirement of Pope Francis's leadership and pastoral theology is closeness to the ground. I use this term to label his need to lead from the ground up, to become present directly with those who are suffering the most, as he showed with migrants and refugees in Lampedusa or with prisoners and inmates in pretty much everywhere he goes. In Latin American liberation theology, especially one shaped by the philosophy of Ignacio Ellacuría, one of the martyred Jesuits at the UCAN in El Salvador, such closeness to the ground serves the purpose of honesty with the real. This is seen as a central requirement of followers of Christ, who is all truth in opposition to the master of lies. Transformative action for justice seems to happen from the middle down or from the bottom to the next level, but never from the middle up. This, by contrast to the hope of most of 20th century Catholic social teaching that somehow continues or promoted conversion of hearts as trickle down, as a sort of a trickle down effect to change the situation of those at the bottom. Take, for example, Fratelli Tutti. Oh, excuse me. Take, for example, the fact that I've been mentioning throughout my talk, low-level local government officials. Many activist groups and popular movements have found in these local councilors, mayors, and other officials, people close to the ground, close to the suffering, willing to take risks for transforming reality effectively, rather than spend their time negotiating at the big tables with regional governments or corporations. While Laudato Si speaks directly to governments and corporations to do the right thing and prioritize the poor, indigenous, preserving of natural resources, and reversing climate change, to essentially reject the throwaway culture, these do not move with the urgency or the precision of the popular activist groups at the bottom. Obviously, many of these have a stake in the game. They are close to the communities, villages, and regions most directly impacted by climate change. Their water, food, housing, and job supply are continually threatened by the masters of greed. Therefore, when it's time to mobilize, they need very little incentive. They feel with their fellow folks on the ground the brunt of global corporate greed and the deep sting of the indifference of so many. I was made aware recently of this mass that took place in Honduras, and it was a mass carried out at the intersection of roads needed to get to a river where a corporation is planning on building an hydroelectric power plant. And so one of the ways that they decided to stop the corporation from moving toward the river is to keep holding these masses on the ground, precisely in the middle of the road. So that's the kind of on-the-ground mobilization that you see. Finally, Laudato Si also served as an invitation. It generated an interreligious global dialogue with Pope Francis as a global reference point. The encyclical generated responses from other churches and world religions, already theologically grounded in eco-theology and committed to environmental justice, such as the Orthodox Church, evangelical churches, the World Council of Churches, Protestant groups, the United Nations, and indigenous organizations. In this sense, Laudato Si broke boundaries that previous encyclicals of Catholic social teaching had not been able to achieve. Churches, dioceses that were able to respond with a similar affinity were already grounded in work for environmental justice and work with those most impacted by climate change and resource extraction. The nearness to the suffering of these church communities already had them practicing a pastoral stance of urgency, nimbleness, and solidarity, and closeness to the ground. So what are some obstacles? One of the quotes from one of the activists thinking again on the 5th anniversary of the letter goes, "Ecclesially and pastorally, we still have many challenges. The ones who had the geographic mission of the church have not taken on the prophetic denouncement called for in the encyclical. There has been little positioning for its cause. We can observe isolated cases, but very few, having to do with the environment and environmental justice. Culture wars have kept many sectors of the church in the US removed from the urgency, nimbleness, and closeness to the ground needed to fully incorporate Laudato Si into the US religious imagination in the same way as it has been able to do in other parts of the world. In the US, but also globally, church leadership is resistant to establishing the kinds of solidary relations that have made Laudato Si successful on the ground in other places. The official church organizations such as Caritas, Catholic Relief Services, and Catholic Charities are not wont to the kinds of cross-organization solidarity building needed to give Laudato Si secure footing and traction at the heart of empire. This siloed self-understanding is partly driven by fears that the church's purity in doctrine and mission will be corrupted by associating with underground local and global networks of workers for environmental justice that might threaten the Catholic organization's standing among the faithful. We see this especially in reference with other groups' stances on birth control and regulation of births, the leadership of women and women's ordination, and modes of acting in the world. Capitalism and the throwaway culture is another particular challenge. You as Christians have the most to lose from the kind of decentering exhibited in Pope Francis's leadership and called for in Evangelicarium, Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti. We have not built churches where this kind of decentering is either welcome, nurtured, or encouraged. US Catholicism continues to be beholden to capitalism's throes and whims, with very little critical resistance in any practical way. The US Church's resistance to publicly and positionally stand squarely on the side of migrants and refugees, the imprisoned, African Americans, LGBTQ plus folk, indigenous peoples, and against the forces of domination, inclusion, or marginalization, effectively prevent this decentering task. The church and science continue to have a rocky relationship in many places. Just think about the discussions that have been happening in so many dioceses about returning to full church structures for Sunday Mass, and some pastors even joining the politicized battle about face masks. Among church leadership, we continue to see vestiges of battles from centuries past, where scientific evidence is looked at with suspicion, as if it presented an affront to the doctrine of the church. Laudato Si tried to end this tension once and for all by building scientific observation into a theology of nature and as an important element of our understanding of the created world. For a few decades now, the Vatican itself has created various offices and ties with scientists and their organizations for cooperation. But this embrace of science does not filter to the local dioceses and churches, steeped in suspicion that key teachings about the family, reproduction, birth control, marriage, gender, and sexuality will come into question. So moving forward, what are some recommendations? We must stop judging activist groups and the priests and faithful who join these groups and create coalitions with them as Marxists and socialists, and even begin to question why these are the boogeymen within Catholic social teaching, as against the family, as against the teaching of the church. To the extent that priests and pastoral agents are involved with these groups, these too are labeled as Marxist and against the teaching of the church on key culture war areas. We must stop limiting the role of women, who are the central actors of popular movements, especially the ones laying down their lives for environmental justice and the protection of ecosystems, such as Berta Cáceres and Sister Dorothy Stang. We must become and give birth to and nourish a church of open doors. The call in Evangelicarium, Laudato Si, and now Fratelli Tutti must seriously engage and incorporate the praxis of popular movements, as well of building strategic coalitions of solidarity for effective change. In the US, for example, we've yet to have a clear coalition between the Catholic Church and the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think that is disastrous. And in the US especially, we must understand that ecological justice, environmental justice goes hand in hand with racial justice and gender justice. And this is so in the US and globally. And then also building collaboration, coalitions, and projects of fraternization, as Fratelli Tutti calls it, hermanización in Spanish, making brothers and sisters of all, across Christian traditions with those already working for ecological justice, but also working with groups that may have contrary ideas to some of our basic doctrines, but whose goals we can share in the struggle for ecological and environmental justice. So I close with some comments from Gabriela Holguín, the Argentinian activist I mentioned earlier. Laudato Si continues to bear great hope. She says, quote, "In this moment of profound human pain, when it seems that all assurances created by humans are fading away, popular movements can contribute from our lived experience to an evolutionary leap of conscience that humanity must take. This, as long as we do not reproduce the exclusions and models of efficiency that are so often imposed on us by governments and corporations." Close quote. The hope that Holguín suggests is that Laudato Si might serve as an evolutionary leap of conscience. With the release of Fratelli Tutti, I think it will be very difficult to turn back the clock on this evolutionary leap of conscience that Francis has ushered. It is the call to a global solidarity that begins on the ground, closest to those with real skin in the game, but that must also mobilize diocesan, regional, and national church efforts to be effective at the scale needed to impact the alarming trends of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Davila. You certainly give a prophetic and urgent message for all of us. And I know my personal spirituality will take away this phrase of decentering, this decentering exercise that you speak about. So thank you so much for sharing with us this evening. I am now privileged to welcome back to St. Mary's College, Father Daniel Horan. Daniel P. Horan, OFM, PhD, is the Duns Scotus Chair of Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where he teaches systematic theology and spirituality. He is a columnist for the National Catholic Reporter and the author of 12 books, including Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, a Contemporary Theological Anthropology. Father Horan regularly lectures around the US and abroad. He serves on a number of university, academic, and publication editorial boards, including the St. Bonaventure University Board of Trustees, the Franciscan School of Theology Board of Regents, and the Board of Directors of the International Thomas Merton Society. Father Horan is the co-host of the Francis Effect podcast. Father Horan, welcome back to St. Mary's College.
Other than we have a problem with your audio. It's still not working.
We cannot hear you.
How about now?
Try one more time.
Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. How's that? Everybody, am I good?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So I just began by saying thank you to Arlene and to all your colleagues at St. Mary's for this opportunity. And, what a joy it is to be with my distinguished colleague, Professor M.T. Davila. Thank you, M.T., for that wonderful presentation. And I think my prepared remarks right now will build on where Professor Davila left us. Laying the groundwork for this important work that continues to be needed, that's being done in certain parts of the world, inspired by Laudato Si, and where we need to go from here. So I want to begin by talking a bit about reception, our theme for this evening, and to acknowledge that reception, particularly when we think about an encyclical letter as church teaching like Laudato Si, can mean a few different things in the Catholic tradition. There is the general sort of colloquial understanding of the term, which usually refers to the way someone is disposed to what is presented. For example, You might describe your reception by a group or organization or a community as being warm or welcoming, or perhaps cold or hostile or even rude. This common sense understanding offers us, I believe, a helpful metric for evaluation. And based on reporting from the media and Catholic environmental advocacy groups, a number of them Professor Davila has already mentioned, I would say that the reception of Laudato Si in this common sense understanding of the term reception is, well, very mixed. And it's mixed from a global perspective. And I'm going to say more about the US context in particular, since Professor Davila has laid out such a great overview of some of the global embraces and receptions of Laudato Si. There have been some tremendous efforts on the part of religious orders and dioceses, individual parishes, and nonprofit Catholic organizations around the globe and here in the United States. I think, for instance, of the Catholic Climate Covenant or even the ecumenical organization that predated Laudato Si called Green Faith, that has nonetheless promoted the message of and action and praxis arising from Laudato Si over these last 5 years. And yet, there have also been a number of strong pockets of resistance, as again, Professor Davila has introduced for us, especially in the United States Church. Sadly, the latter is often fueled by partisan civil politics that ally themselves with climate change skepticism, the fossil fuel industry, and a distorted commitment to free market capitalism, a topic that is critiqued not only by Pope Francis and Laudato Si, and now more recently in Fratelli Tutti, but is also something that was critiqued regularly by his two papal predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. I think an illustration that best describes or kind of provides us with an example of this approach or reception of Laudato Si, especially in the US context, is illustrated well by an article in the conservative magazine, The Federalist, which upon the release of Laudato Si in June of 2015, included the following description. It described Laudato Si as, quote, a malignant jumble of dubious science, policy prescriptions, and doomsday rhetoric, unquote. In addition to the remarkable reach of partisan influences that have shaped the outlooks of many Catholic clergy and laity, another significant factor in the mixed response to Laudato Si, especially in the US context, has been the notable failure of leaders in the American church to maintain consistency with regard to the ecclesial reception of this magisterial teaching and its implementation by the bishops of the United States. Indeed, some bishops have been extremely committed to the praxis called for by Laudato Si and Pope Francis's insistence that we must be people who interpret the world around us and base our decisions on the principle of intrical ecology, which recognizes the inherent interconnectedness and interrelatedness of all creation, human and non-human alike. But the overwhelming majority of bishops and dioceses in the United States have nevertheless remained silent or neutral, to even at times expressing a kind of outright hostility to this particular Catholic social teaching. This sort of response and lack of ecclesiastical leadership directly affects the second way we can talk about reception in the Catholic theological tradition. And here I mean what ecclesiologists refer to as ecclesial reception. As one ecclesiologist puts it, broadly speaking, ecclesial reception refers to the process by which some teaching, ritual, discipline, or law is assimilated into the life of the church. And I think in the first presentation, we saw some examples, some illustrations of people at the grassroots level, at the on the ground level, in the parochial level, in the base level, who are seeking to implement and assimilate this teaching into their life. But it's lacking, both and especially in the United States, but elsewhere around the globe, from the leadership in our church. In this sense, the question is less about gauging the popularity or favorability that individuals or communities have in response to what they have read or heard, and more to do with how and in what way this authoritative teaching is actualized in the praxis, in the life of the church. Unlike many other parts of the world, the bishops in the United States have, comparably speaking, really failed to exercise their responsibility to assist the local churches, which we call more colloquially dioceses, in assimilating the teachings of Laudato Si, leaving the bulk of successful efforts as we've seen so far to date, to grassroots organizers and individual communities. But nevertheless, dropping the ball when it comes to their part on the ongoing and dynamic process of ecclesial reception of the teaching in the church is a major obstacle, especially in the United States. So with the remainder of my time for the prepared remarks on this panel, I want to talk about three things. I want to continue to explore this question about the idea of ecclesial reception and how it has yet to take widespread root in the United States so far. Then I want to talk about the overarching principles outlined in Laudato Si, specifically focusing on the notion of intrical ecology and its consequences, its implications. And we see that as well echoed more recently, just a few weeks ago, with the issuing of the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which picks up some of these themes again. And I believe that we require greater attention, teaching, reception, and actualization on both fronts with both teachings. And then finally, I want to pose and respond to the question, is Laudato Si, 5 years out or at any point from its issuing, the end or the beginning, perhaps, of church teaching on creation and our human part within it? So first, this concept of ecclesial reception. Despite the misinformed claims of some men and women, including some church ministers, Catholic doctrine does in fact change and develop. Now, this might seem like a non sequitur, but it's important for us to keep this in mind, that it always has, it always will, and it does so, we believe, under the guidance and direction of the Holy Spirit. God neither hands down a propositional list of doctrinal claims already made and set to go, nor does God possess literally, like a ghost or some sort of haunting spirit. God doesn't come down and embody popes or bishops or lay people or theologians or anybody else in order to kind of dictate static faith claims. Instead, God works in and through the world, in history, in time, in space, in the cultures, in the locations, in the places where we find ourselves. The name that we give to this dynamism of God's speaking to and through and with the community is called the process of reception. And it begins with the lived realities of all the baptized, all women and men and children of faith who experience God in and through the world, and as I've said, in history and time and space, and always in context. Tradition is not about concrete tablets magically sketched in stone and preserved by church leaders. Tradition, or as theologian Orlando Espín puts it more dynamically, traditioning, is the work of the church cooperating with God's grace. While this dynamic has been in existence for millennia, I always like to return to now St. John Henry Newman's thoughts in the 19th century, who helps us systematize the process in three stages, three moments of this dynamic, which we might call articulation, pedagogy or teaching, and reception. Richard Gallardi, an ecclesiologist at Boston College, summarizes the way these three stages work in the following way. With regard to church teaching, he says, first, there is articulation or expression of the Christian faith in the lived lives, the experiences, the liturgy, the devotional practices, the religious art, and the like of the people of God. The second moment or stage is characterized as teaching or pedagogy, in which the ecclesiastical magisterium recognizes, sees what is present and emerging in the lived experience of the people of God. And that which is articulated in the faith of the baptized, they receive and authoritatively then present in a more clear, straightforward, or we might say propositional form. Gallardi points out, drawing from Newman, that the final moment is reception, what we're thinking about in some ways tonight, in which the faithful either do or do not recognize the faith authoritatively proclaimed as their own. After the Council of Trent, it became commonplace to conceive of church teaching as unilateral, as from the top down in a pyramidal structure. And I'm so appreciative of Professor Davila pointing this out, that she made reference to in ages past, and in this past understanding continues, I would say, to haunt so many of church leaders and the faithful more broadly to this day. The idea then that the Pope or Bishop say something and the people passively accept it, no questions asked, is the sort of expectation. However, the Second Vatican Council returned to the early church into, as well as drawing from insights from the 19th century, like from Newman and among others, to understand this threefold process, how church teaching actually arises, how it's actually expressed, how it's actually embodied. Pope Francis signals this throughout Laudato Si, especially in his strong emphasis on the importance of dialogue. Christians are meant to hear and engage with the best insights within the philosophical, theological, scientific, cultural, and among so many other fields of human knowledge. Something that's been near and dear to Pope Francis's heart is also the recognition of more ancient wisdom than even the kind of ancient tradition of Christianity. We think of indigenous cultures and wisdoms and insights. What these areas are showing us is the devastating consequences of our human self-centeredness, what we technically oftentimes call anthropocentrism. And we've seen how this has devastating consequences to both the most vulnerable in the human family and the rest of the broader community of creation. Put simply, we can see this as a form of the articulation that Newman outlines, articulation expressed by activists on the ground, articulation expressed by those who see firsthand the devastating consequences of human-centered ways of thinking and human-influenced global climate change. In other words, the Spirit of God is operative in the world and through the human community, inspiring our increasing awareness of the need to respond to this human-caused global climate change. Ideally, that next stage or moment, pedagogy or teaching, involves church leadership, and this is why I'm focusing on them in these remarks, especially the Pope and other bishops, recognizing what is being expressed through the people of God, what is being first articulated. It is then discerned, engaged, and developed into authoritative teaching, such as Laudato Si, which is expressed in apostolic exhortations, documents from regional bishops' conferences, or encyclicals like we have that we're celebrating, that we're commemorating this night. It is then the responsibility, and this is important, not only for the people of God, the sensus fidelium, to respond and absorb the church's teaching, but it's important that the church's primary pastors and teachers, who are themselves the bishops, to teach this, to hand this on, to tradere, as we say in Latin. When this process is successful, then we can talk about the reception of the teaching in terms of the sensus fidelium, or sense of the faithful, which means that all the baptized, the lay and the ordained, the religious, everybody, have recognized and responded to what was first articulated and then later expressed and taught. Sometimes teachings are not necessarily received by the faithful, and this is not automatically a sign that a teaching is misguided or errant. That takes time, it takes discernment, it takes dialogue. And we can think of lots of examples, perhaps. Probably the most famous in the 20th and 21st century is the church's teaching after Paul VI encyclical in 68 on Humanae Vitae, on artificial contraception. Again, just quoting Gallardi, he explains that a teaching that has not been received is not for that reason necessarily false. The claim is, in fact, more empirical in character. A teaching that is not received is not efficacious. It has no transformative power within the community. In short, a non-received teaching becomes irrelevant to the life of a community, end quote. And the reason why I emphasize that is because oftentimes, especially when I've had the great privilege to travel in other parts of the world and see firsthand a lot of the examples that Professor Davila has mentioned and others, or hear from folks, I'm oftentimes asked why the US seems to be so out of step with the rest of the world. And I think we have to acknowledge part of it is this missing piece about the fact that if something hasn't been taught to begin with, hasn't been exposed, hasn't been encouraged, hasn't been pastorally embraced at the local church level, at the diocesan level, at the parish level, then there isn't an opportunity for that efficacious, transformative power of the teaching to take hold. Thinking about Ecclesial Reception of Laudato Si in the US context, I think it's important to note how many Catholics have not received the teaching. But I believe that generally speaking, this is because of, in many cases, no fault of their own. There is some responsibility, and we are responsible for our own faith and our own education, but there is a big glaring absence here. There's a lacuna in the process of reception. The US bishops are the ones who are primarily responsible for this failure in my eyes, a failure of their own duty as the primary pastors and teachers of their diocese. It's interesting, and I don't think you could find a single bishop, for example, who would publicly dismiss the teaching on contraception I mentioned in passing a moment ago from Paul VI encyclical Humanae Vitae. And yet many have gone on record to downplay or even disparage Laudato Si, which was taught with exactly the same authority as Humanae Vitae and by the same medium of teaching, an encyclical letter. In other words, Laudato Si and the wisdom and Catholic social teaching it contains is non-negotiable in terms of something we can just take or leave at our leisure or at our pleasure. It calls for discernment, it calls for appropriation, it calls for engagement. And yet, curiously, within the American framework, infected as we are by the virus of political division, it is considered a fair target for ridicule or worse. Think back to that article from the Federalist I quoted. I believe that the sensus fidelium on the topic of Laudato Si, as indicated by two demographics, reflects a strong affirmation of the teaching's potential reception, even if it hasn't been fully realized in the US context. And here I'm thinking of our sisters and brothers around the globe, particularly in the Southern hemispheres, especially in South America. And I'm also thinking, even within the US context, of the younger generations in the United States, millennials and Gen Z in particular. Even among those who identify as politically conservative, these young people do not deny the basic scientific truth of human-caused global climate change. It is, however, those older generations, most of whom are those who occupy positions of leadership, authority, and power in the church, that may have other interests that promote denialism in both the political and ecclesial spheres. So let me, with just the few minutes I have left, talk about this overarching theme of Laudato Si, which I think is incredibly important for us to think about and has been mentioned quite a bit already this evening, and that is the notion of intrical ecology. It is the governing principle of Laudato Si. If there was one thing to take away from a 200+ paragraph document, Pope Francis is not known for his brevity, even if he is a great writer with great consultors. This notion of intrical ecology is basically the idea that everything is connected. It's rooted in the central Catholic social teaching of the common good. It has ties to the other principles, the principles of solidarity, the principle of the inherent dignity of the human person, the principle of the integrity of creation and care for creation, and so on and so on. Intrical ecology, by its definition, is an umbrella term to help bring all of these aspects together. This recognition of inherent interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and interdependence of all creation should govern how we think about ourselves, the world, and our actions within it. How we act and relate in one sphere, that is the human sphere, the political sphere, the educational sphere, the family sphere, how we act and decide and behave in one is tied inextricably to the other, the human to the non-human. There's a phrase that Pope Francis cites in Laudato Si he uses, but doesn't offer the attribution to Professor Leonardo Boff of Brazil, a former Franciscan friar and theologian who wrote a book in 1997 with the title Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, which expresses this interconnection, particularly as experienced by those most vulnerable, those most precarious. Pope Francis says in paragraph 49 of Laudato Si, today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The way we think about, view, and treat non-human creation is directly tied to the human creaturely order, and there's so much we can unpack there. But it calls us as Christians to reframe our discernment and decision-making processes. When making economic, financial, and policy choices, we must keep in mind that environmental and human social crises are not separate, but as Pope Francis says, one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Some business and political leaders, and in fact, even some church leaders, say protecting the environment will hurt the economy and therefore hurt the poor, as if to make a case to subordinate our concern for non-human creation to our own immediate short-term needs. But Pope Francis notes that authentic development requires considering many factors, not singular factors. And oftentimes those critiques come from places of financial and political power that value things by GDP or by stock market rises. The human poor do not benefit from the rise in the stock market, nor does the rest of creation, including things like the forests of the Amazon that are burning or the West Coast of the United States that are burning, or those who face the consequence that Professor Davila is talking about right now in the Caribbean, when we think about all the possible ecological disasters that are unfolding every single day. Models for creation and our place within it are to be challenged by Laudato Si. I think that there is a movement that is signaled here that I'll speak about in just a moment as I close. But I think one of the things that's important for us to take away with this notion of an integral ecology is to reinsert ourselves back into the singular world of which we are a part and from which we came and to which we will one day return. Think about that at Lent. Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. We are creatures too. I'll say one last thing before I close and talk about whether Laudato Si should be viewed as an end or a beginning. And that is this notion of an integral ecology. You know, if I may nerd out for a minute, etymologically, the word ecology comes from two words in Greek, oikos, logos. This idea of talking about, writing about, thinking about, describing the oikos. And oikos simply means household. And so if a integral ecology is thinking about the household as interrelated and interconnected, then I think one of the implications that arises, especially for us in very privileged contexts like in the United States, and especially those who are in social locations of greater privilege within the US context, need to realize that our economy, which comes from the same root word, oikos nomos, the law or structure of the household, should reflect that integral ecology. In other words, our Pope Francis's call for an integral ecology means that we should shape our policies, practices, laws, structures, our whole society, always with reference to and arising from this notion of our interconnectedness, that we are creation too, that we are all part of one created reality. I think it's important too that another implication that arises from this is a reality that sometimes people find a little off-putting, but I'll be blunt about it. There is no greater life issue for a pro-life community like the Roman Catholic Church and Christians more broadly, and all women and men of goodwill, than care for creation. It does no good for us to advocate on behalf of this or that particular group of human beings just within the human family if there is no world in which those humans can live and flourish and exist. And so I think that's important as well when we think about an integral ecology. There is no such thing as a singular human life issue. There is only an integrated sense of pro-life issues. I think of what Bishop McElroy said recently when he said, reflecting on what the USCCB had said in its new letter for the voting document for 2020, that though the bishops voted overwhelmingly to emphasize abortion as the preeminent life issue, Bishop McElroy of San Diego, who was an earlier guest here at St. Mary's, rightly says, sure, it is a preeminent issue, but it is not the only one. Creation is a life issue. In closing, I just want to suggest that Laudato Si might not be an ending, but rather a beginning. It is not the closing of the book on the church's teaching on creation and humanity's relationship to it, but a starting point, one in which we are beckoned forward to actualize our faith, to put our faith into practice, and to reconceive not only the church, not only our spiritual practices or devotional practices or sense of self, but to truly restructure our society, our policies, our communities, our politics, our educational context, the way we run universities, and so forth. This interconnection between the human and non-human world has dramatic implications that may seem new to a lot of Western thinking modern people, but not so new to the indigenous wisdoms that have long sustained communities throughout the globe. And I think one of the things Pope Francis has encouraged the church to remember is that we have a lot to learn from others, and that Catholics who find themselves, who arise out of, whose experiences are shaped by their particular cultural context, offer other communities and other cultures insight as well. I believe that Laudato Si is a beginning, and that there's a lot of unfinished business that involves not only the reception and a fuller reception of the teaching itself, but more importantly, its implementation and actualization. If we want the reception of Laudato Si to be meaningful, to be substantive, to not be irrelevant, to not be ignored, then the work has to be done not only at the grassroots level, but this requires of those in positions of church leadership, whether ordained or lay, whether bishops or others, to take seriously the challenge that the Holy Father has placed before us, recognizing, of course, that it's guided by the Holy Spirit and that we're all in this together, because integral ecology is absolutely true. We're only always interconnected. Everything is connected. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Horan, for another prophetic message. I especially appreciate your emphasis on integral ecology and on the ancient wisdom of indigenous communities that Pope Francis draws upon, as well as a reminder that reception is about the lived realities of the baptized. I really think we have a lot to discuss tonight. I'm going to invite Father Horan and Professor Davila to comment on each other's talks for a few minutes, and then we will open it up to question and answer. So Father Horan and Professor Davila.
I'm not sure where to begin. I just want to express first and foremost my gratitude.
I'm sorry, Father Horan, we couldn't hear you for a minute there. We cannot hear you.
How about now?
A little bit. It's fuzzy.
Professor Davila, why don't you get started and I'll see if
Sure, I can definitely. So thank you again, or thank you for the first time for your comments and reflections, especially on the differentiations between receptions, forms of receptions, and how teaching, magisterial teaching, authoritative teaching is adopted. I was really struck as someone who's done a lot of work on the culture wars in the US and sort of how I work a lot from the perspective of the option for the poor. And I try to see what are obstacles to the option for the poor. Why is the US church so resistant to it? It struck me when you said Laudato Si is coming from the same magisterial platform as Humanae Vitae, as all the other encyclicals that have shaped 20th century and 21st century Catholicism globally. And yet somehow the advent of this, or the arrival of this Argentinian, Latin American, Southern Hemisphere Pope has really seems to have given people a license to take his insights and his expansion and movement, incredibly grounded on John Paul II and Benedict the 16th, who are his sort of frames of reference, especially in Fratelli Tutti. Benedict the 16th is one of the biggest places of reference in the footnotes. And yet it is seen as non-magisterial or as able to be rejected. It's looked at with suspicion. Again, that accusation of Marxism, socialism is lodged against Pope Francis certainly by very outlying Catholic commentators, but also by some Catholic commentators who have a larger platform and who have a sort of greater gravitas in different forms of media and a wider audience, especially among the bishops. So is there something you notice about the advent of this Pope, the arrival of this papacy, and that questioning or not seeing his teaching as authoritative as, say, John Paul II was, or Paul VI, or any of his predecessors?
Yeah, that's really important. Let me just ask first, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think you're spot on. And you know what comes to mind is the kind of integral reality of othering that plays out. So if we talk about hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor being, you know, as you mentioned, the option for the poor not just being necessarily financial poor, but we could think of all other forms of marginalization, of those who are in precarious situations, disenfranchisement, and so forth, as a kind of a collective under this category of poor. As goes one, so goes the other. You know, this is something that a lot of environmental feminists have talked about, of course, that the way that, you know, human societies that are oftentimes controlled and dominated by men in power, treat women the way that we treat the so-called not natural world. I would say the greater than human natural world. And so I think you're onto something. It strikes me that to talk about the first pope in modern times to come from the global South, who comes from, you know, Argentina, who is not European, and is seen as dismissible, not taken as serious, seen as other. I think there's something to that. And I think it's also instructive for us when we think about the challenge that's before us, that, you know, what are the consequences of this teaching for issues like environmental racism, or, you know, the way that environmental misogyny takes place. And we can think of lots of examples of, you know, the tremendous work that's been done to highlight that. But I honestly think that's a big piece of the puzzle. I also think that part of, well, I don't know. I think that may be the biggest piece of the puzzle. The more that I think about it, is that the lens, the clear expressed lens from which Pope Francis is offering this teaching that you rightly said, builds on his predecessors. I mean, this isn't ex nihilo. This isn't from out of the blue or made whole cloth. This is building on everything that has come before. But the primary lens and the voices that are allowed to inform the expression of the teaching is very different than the sort of exclusively self-referential European North American context. I say that with an asterisk because I have, and I'm sure you do too, a number of critiques about Fratelli Tutti and who isn't represented in that document. But at least thinking about Laudato Si specifically, one thing that Pope Francis does is broaden the conversation and draws from insights of bishops' conferences from around the globe. And so there are more Asian perspectives and South American perspectives and African perspectives than we've seen really in any modern encyclical letter or other papal document. So I have no doubt that triggers a response from those used to being in power, used to being in control, even if he's saying the same thing, as oftentimes he is. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Is there, you know, when you think about grassroots movements, the organizations that you cited and drew kind of insight from, I really appreciated the categories of urgency, nimbleness, and solidarity, and closeness to the ground, closeness to the poor. Do you see illustrations of that playing out, you know, particularly in the U.S. context too, or opportunities that could, you know, that could be further strengthened here? Because I think that's really, really important, as you know.
Yeah, I have been trying to identify that. And I think, you know, you mentioned the Catholic Climate Covenant. There's certainly a few other groups that are trying to do that. But there is U.S. Catholicism's emphasis on purity of doctrine, or doctrinal and ritualist purity, really seems to prevent some of that work at the ground, even at the ground level, because there's always this suspicion that there's going to be a lens that's going to be put at these activities, signaling and pointing out where they've stepped out of line, or where they've established a partnership or a coalition with a group that has other interests or other categories in their definitions and their platforms that are contrary to the teaching of the church. So that really, in fact, sort of inoculates even the most ardent local activists, unless they just push aside that higher up diocesan level and up kind of evaluation. So yes, for example, there are the orders of men, religious men and religious women who do establish those coalitions with worker movements, with Black Lives Matter activists, with other feminist groups. And they will establish these coalitions around particular either environmental efforts or worker rights efforts or racial justice efforts, especially around migrant efforts. You see a lot of that coalition building around the border with Unitarian Universalists, with evangelicals, with just a number of people, non-sectarian groups working for justice around the border. So that's a place where I see people, Catholic groups on the ground, breaking boundaries and borders and establishing those coalitions in ways that sort of leave aside or put aside that emphasis on doctrinal purity for the sake of being in solidarity with migrants, refugees, and actually the environment at the border, which happens to be a big loser in our battles along the border, certainly with humongous repercussions, environmental repercussions for building up the wall that it's supposed to be being built along the US-Mexico border. So it really, it's not facilitated. We have not built a church in the US that, other than religious men and women and independent lay groups, that actually embraces that kind of cross-boundary activity, even at the schools level. So elementary schools, Catholic elementary schools, Catholic high schools, that's still not happening. There's just profound distrust or resistance to embracing the praxis of another group and joining them in a particular struggle. I'm not entirely sure what would be good tools for doing that, other than raising holy trouble, hagan lío. And I saw a question of where does that come from? But that is, Father Dan, tell me if I'm remembering correctly. I believe that that's something that he spoke in Rio to the youth at the gathering of youth in when he visited Brazil, I think, but I'm gonna try to look it up. But it became sort of this sense, and it was very early on in his papacy, where he asked the youth to be troublemakers for justice, to be troublemakers for the environment, to be troublemakers for solidarity.
It reminds me of the late Congressman John Lewis's great line about good trouble. I mean, there's such parallels there, and I can't help but remember as well at the gathering of the youth from around the globe before the Synod on Young Adults. Pope Francis encouraged them too not to be afraid to ask tough questions, to be courageous. And to this day, I love to go back to that document, not the documents of the Synod itself, but the document from the spring, where these young adults were courageous. I mean, they named things as they were, not just the environment, as important as that is, but they talked about both concerns about the environment and concerns about the human society, their respective communities, and the various forms of oppression, raising questions about how we live authentically Christian discipleship within the church when, for instance, there's this longstanding history of mistreatment of women or the silencing of certain communities and who has what access to power and voice and so forth. So I think it's interesting, your point too about like one of the big obstacles in the US context is this fear of coalition building because of various markers of ideological or doctrinal purity. But the follow-up question I always ask myself, because I think you're 100% right, is, well, it depends on what the doctrine is. Clearly, if the doctrine is about care for creation or the option for the poor, well, that's not something that the folks who are there with their kind of clipboards and their doctrinal purity tests are concerned about. They tend to be very narrowly conceived, oftentimes sexual biomedical ethics issues, and that's about it. Not to overly generalize, but yeah, it's disturbing.
I'm going to jump in here. Thank you both very much. You have generated so many wonderful things for us all to ponder and lots of questions in the chat box. So I'm going to pose the first one to you both and piggyback on just what you were talking about. This is a question from one of our college students here at St. Mary's, which we always love to start with the youth voices. And she asks, do you think U.S. Catholic churches focus on U.S. Catholics, Catholic persons, I guess, focus on doctrine is shaped by our country's Protestant and Puritan roots, those who focused heavily on purity and roots, much as you were just talking about?
So short answer is yes. Longer answer has to do, I would say, with yes, the history that you've proposed, that gets embedded in our way of life, and it is a notion that it in fact goes further than just doctrinal purity, because it also becomes part and parcel with nationalism and visions of the common good that become embedded and legalized in the US, that then sort of cement into the structures of our society those kinds of ideas about what is a good citizen, what are the rights of a citizen, instead of the rights of everyone in the land, right? So we sort of moved into this nation being a nation, or even Catholics in this nation, supporting the common good for all who live in the land, which is the biblical understanding of the common good, to a common good, an understanding of the common good that's really limited to citizenship, and a very specific kind of citizenship. So yeah, there's a very long way in which that Puritanism that you reference historically then gets embedded and does begin to shape how all the different religious traditions participate in the public square, and which kinds of ideas and structures they defend in the public square and uphold.
Yeah, I would just simply add too, I think there's a common problem in US education. You know, Professor Davila mentioned the various levels, elementary, high school, college, and so forth. But there's a collective cultural amnesia, and it's a selective amnesia of forgetting. And I think it's gotten worse over time, where people have lost the sense of context, historical context. So if we would go, for instance, to the kind of philosophers that informed the drafting of the kind of fundamental documents of the U.S. Nation, right? But in the late 18th century, you have people like John Stuart Mill and John Locke, who talked about freedom, and it was that sort of thing that informed a lot of the discussions around how we would frame this experiment that we have, we recognize now as the United States. There was a great op-ed over the weekend, I believe it was in the New York Times, where somebody was pointing out that there was always a qualified freedom. I mean, it's interesting because these are not religious philosophers as such, Mills or Locke, but they tend to be kind of beloved ideological and intellectual, favorites of certain politicians and thinkers today who disregard those qualifications that are included. And I think actually it's important for us to realize that that slippage is, as Professor Davila said, becomes instantiated in our laws and in our practices and in our kind of common sense way of thinking, that freedom is about individual liberties to the exclusion of all else. And that is, there's nothing more antithetical to, Catholic social teaching than that. And I would just add that Laudato Si reiterates that the common good is not just the human common good. The encyclicals addressed to all who share our common home, not all humans, all of us. And I maybe I sound a little too, kind of Franciscan, love the animals, this kind of thing, especially in my habit, but there's something profound about our interrelatedness that we can't, as human beings, do anything on our own. And I think that our freedom at the expense of the broader common good of the whole of creation, is what the Pope is calling us to keep in mind and to challenge.
This is perhaps maybe a shorter or a longer term answer for a follow-up on that. There are several questions that are relating to teaching and then reception by those in power, be they corporate executives or politicians, members of Congress, Supreme Court justices. So I'll kind of group those together. And people are asking, should the church be doing educational outreach to corporations? Can someone offer a seminar on Laudato Si for politicians and to show them its roots in papal letters going back beyond prior to Pope Francis? Is that an idea that you think could be of use in aiding the reception of this?
If I may start the response, because I'll try to keep it brief with an anecdote. I love the idea. I think it's an improbable idea. It's certainly possible, but very improbable. The year actually was the fall after, in 2015, after the encyclical came out, I was giving a workshop to all the diocesan clergy of a particular diocese in a northeastern state here in the United States. And there was incredible division among the presbyterate, among the priests of that diocese, about how they perceived and viewed the encyclical and who would read it and who wouldn't, and whose kind of prejudgment was shaped by whatever particular political ideology they happened to identify with. And it became a very heated experience among brother priests and bishops in this particular community. And I'll never forget the absolute resistance to the idea. And this isn't a corporation, this isn't a nonprofit, this is the ministers of the church who are ordained to serve the people of God and to be communicators and teachers of these documents. So I don't mean to be so pessimistic, but I love the idea, but I think there's work that has to be done ad intra too. I mean, there's so much great work being done at the grassroots level and by other organizations. But I think when it comes to the formation of our church leaders and ministers, it has to start there. That's my initial reaction to that wonderful idea.
I think that says it all in the sense of that internal work that needs to be done. We have I think it's very difficult for bishops to extend the call of Laudato Si, not just to their faithful, but to corporations, global organizations, when in fact there's bishops and priests misunderstanding or misrepresenting the role of Pope Francis and the Vatican at the UN, because they've become suspicious of global governance, which is an ideological position, right? That global governance is set to detract rights from individual nations or to corrupt national sovereignty, right? So there's these ideas out there about what the UN stands for and what the UN represents, such that when Pope Francis speaks at the UN, there's sort of this backlash, right? When in fact, what we ought to be doing is, yes, let's get the voice of this man, let's get the voice of this religious leader up in the higher echelons of global governance, so that maybe then we can begin to shape the kinds of global structures, business structures, marketing structures, and finance structures, which was a dream of Benedict XVI. Again, this is not something supremely leftist, radical socialist. This is Pope Benedict XVI writing about the importance of global financial governance and being able to make a difference and steer it in a particular direction through the influence of people like the Pope and other world religious leaders, that Francis is echoing and also actively living out. But like Father Horan said, there is this internal sort of resistance that is ideological, that does witness to inherent dynamics of our polis, of our particular society, of our particular place in time in the last 50 years of US political culture. And we need to come to terms with that. I wanted to throw in one more wrench in there, which is the way that the clergy sexual abuse crisis has also impacted the church hierarchy at so many levels, and in so many ways has rightfully coming to terms with this violence and with this its grave injustice has in many ways impacted its ability to respond adequately to that task of reception and teaching for Laudato Si and other efforts. Thankfully, Pope Francis is not giving it up, right? I think now we can say that Evangelicalium, which is more of a pastoral letter, Laudato Si, and now Fratelli Tutti serve as a continuum of this new, or not new, what did the Holguin call it, the activists, evolutionary leap of conscience. I love that phrase of hers. I think he's not giving up on that, and he's really pushing that by focusing Fratelli Tutti on the humanity piece, the fact that in order for Laudato Si to even begin to work, we need to understand who we are as human beings. In order for integral ecology to begin to work, we need to understand who we are as human beings and brothers and sisters to all. So my little.
If I can just add to that too, because I think that raising the abuse crisis is really important, and I don't think it's a wrench at all. I think it's a piece of the bigger puzzle, and if everything's related, everything's connected, intrical ecology, then again the devastating realities, criminality, sinfulness of the human society, including the church itself, has impacts that expand without. But what I'm thinking about in particular is the younger generations, the students who are joining us at St. Mary's College and elsewhere, the students who are in high school or elementary school, the young kids who are just being born today, where you see a lot of church leaders and ordinary Christians themselves kind of wringing their hands and being so frustrated about why young people aren't participating in the kind of organized structures of religious life or of the life of faith. And a big part of that is the lack of credibility. And I think the abuse crisis is part of it. But I also think that a major part of this brings us back to Laudato Si, when most of us, myself included, I'm not getting any younger, I've only got so many more decades, God willing, ahead of me. But the younger folks today realize the world that's been handed to them is a world that is on course for destruction. And we see the evidence for that all around us. And what kind of witness, what sort of gospel Christian witness do we have when church leaders are more preoccupied with other things than with some of these incontrovertibly existential crises before us, like the existence of a habitable earth? And so I think that's important, because it reminds me of, where does the credibility, the moral and ethical credibility of our church and its leadership, where is it grounded, and to whom is it oriented? So I think that's really important. I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of comments about people not hearing about Laudato Si from the pews, about not seeing anything come from their diocese about this. So you're touching on, I think, a crucial issue when you mention the moral authority of the bishops in the church to speak on these issues. So I think we have time for one last question. I'm kind of wrap a couple things up in this one, I think, and focus on that ad intra piece. And bring other things around. So you've mentioned, I have one that says, Professor Davila mentioned the interconnection of ecological justice to racial and gender justice. It strikes me that this interconnection underpins the notion of integral ecology that Professor Horan spoke to as well. And you've talked about this a little bit already. It says, I'd love to hear more from our speakers about how the church's failure to address racial and gender justice continues to hinder our reception of Laudato Si and the work of ecological justice. And there are similar questions about understanding the interconnection with all of the pro-life issues and how we encourage our bishops and clergy to be as passionate about this, the integral life issues as you have spoken.
One thing I have, in fact, just today, I'm sorry if I'm not sure if it's a National Catholic Reporter or Commonweal, but one of the two has a piece that just came out today on essentially we cannot be pro-life, a pro-life church without being a racial justice church. We as a nation cannot ring the pro-life anti-abortion bell if we are not coming to terms with our history of slavery, if we are not coming to terms with our history of racial oppression, if we are not coming to terms with internal racist practices within the church. I'm going to name just one because some people are like, no, not within the church, it doesn't happen. I have a student who got her doctorate under me, who's from Haiti and Roman Catholic, and has sought jobs in various dioceses in the area, and has in fact been preemptively told that because she is Haitian, because she has an accent, and because she is Black, she is not going to be given the job, to please give it up, to please pull the application and take it out of submission, because it just it causes trouble in the diocese to have to figure out what to do with this application. This is a prepared woman with a doctorate education. So we do need to deal with our own ad intra racism as a life issue. And the fact that so much of racial justice locally and globally has to do with resource extraction and the universal destination of the goods of creation. That it also includes dealing with conquest, dealing with the treatment of indigenous peoples, dealing with a constitution that inherently assigned 3/5 personhood to an entire group of people in the nation. So they are intimately connected. And with respect to women, it is similarly so. Women's wisdom, ecofeminism were some of the biggest forces arguing and fighting and being active for climate change. And they were vilified by the church. Latin American feminist eco-theologians were told to stop writing by the church. So gender justice becomes also a central issue within the church. But I'll stop there.
I don't know that I have much more to add because it's a big amen on my end to everything that Professor Davila just said. And I was thinking very similarly about just the origins of this, nation of the United States in its history, that we collectively have avoided not only the church's complicity and direct implication in the genocide of Native peoples, in chattel enslavement, the practice of chattel slavery, the enslavement of populations of people, forced migration, the list could go on and on and on. And but we haven't dealt with that outside of the church as well. I mean, it's a both and in this case. And this is not something just of the past. What did we, what is the history of North America over the last 400, 500 years? This is something that's going on right now at this very moment. And, I think, for instance, Professor Davila mentioned Puerto Rico earlier when pointing out the potential crisis right now with that ship in the Caribbean. But, how quickly did the attention of Americans across the United States and others around the globe, how quickly do people lose sight after Hurricane Maria to the terrible devastation that took place in Puerto Rico? People just kind of move on very quickly. And that's a deeply, from the perspective of ad intra of the church, that's a deeply Catholic, country, but it's a country, it's a territory. And that gets to my second point, which is we're living in a moment right now, today, 2020, in which there are, people who have residency and citizenship in this nation who don't have full representation or voice or power. And Puerto Rico is another example of that. There are lots of other examples we could point to too. I think, of course, of maybe the most famous recent national illustration of environmental racism, which is, of course, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. But Flint, Michigan is just one of many, many, many communities. And, you know, this is something that has to be addressed. And it goes back to Professor Davila's point about the need for, you know, coalition building and collaboration between, you know, church entities and church leaders and all the baptized with other people of goodwill. And this is something Pope Francis reiterates again and again in Laudato Si. And he builds, as we both have been saying this evening, builds on the work of his predecessors who call for dialogue, who call for praxis, who call for the embodiment of the tradition that we profess to believe, that we say is our faith. And so I think this is an ongoing issue, and it's something that speaks directly to the heart of that overarching principle of Laudato Si, which is an intrical ecology, that the way that we talk about our household is tied together. Everything relates to one another, including injustice, especially injustice.
I'm going to thank you both for inspiring us to go out now and be those bridge builders, to help be a part of building those coalitions, to take action to spread the word. Thank you for your presentations, answering the questions. I want to give a thank you to the staff of St. Mary's College Campus and Community Events, Integrated Marketing and Communications, and others for their assistance with the logistics, and to the donors who make this Endowed lecture series possible. Thank you to all of you for attending and participating. We hope you'll join us for our second panel in this series on October 29th, Signs of the Times and Laudato Si. Details are at stmarys.edu/events. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much.